Hue, Vietnam, 1968. The Viet Cong went from house to house, building to building, looking for anyone on their lists. The lists contained the names of actual and suspected enemies of the people of Vietnam. When the people on the list were found, many were forced to their knees and shot in the back of the neck, at least during the first hours of the attack. Others, including the secretaries and custodial staff at newspapers, were rounded up and taken to different locations throughout the city, temporary captives. As soon as their captors had gotten together and worked out what to do with them, they were told they will be moved to a location inland and be re-educated. The lucky ones were taken to different Viet Cong camps, and some even to camps in the north. But most were told lies, taken to a wooded or isolated place within the city and clubbed to death. Some were buried alive. Most foreigners, meaning white people, who were caught were also shot. This included reporters, clerks, and minor foreign government officials. When the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were defeated after 26 days of the heaviest fighting of the Vietnam War, they left behind nearly 6,000 victims. Men, women, and children who had been killed as enemies of the people. Today, on a day in history, the Hue Massacre. On January 31st, 1968, the North Vietnamese Army, the VA, and its communist South Vietnamese allies, the Viet Cong, or C, launched the Tet Offensive, a massive attack on South Vietnamese cities, US and South Vietnamese military bases, and political centers, and much more. The now famous attack began as Vietnam was starting the New Year's holiday, or Tet, and was planned intentionally for that day when the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese believed the people of the South, along with their armed forces and those of the Americans, to be least expecting an attack, let alone one which took place throughout the country simultaneously. One of the main targets of the VC and the NVA was Hue, one of the oldest and most important cities in South Vietnam. From 1307 to 1905, the city on the Perfume River was the Vietnamese imperial capital. Even after the capital status was removed when the French took over the country in the early 20th century, Hue continued to play an important symbolic role for the Vietnamese people, and a reminder of its former independence. In 1945, after the Japanese in Vietnam surrendered, North Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh made Hue the capital of Vietnam again, but was forced out when the French returned in force shortly after that. In 1968, Hue was a small city of about 140,000 people. Compared to the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon, nearly 400 miles south, Hue was, and still is, a calm and dignified symbol of former greatness. In 1968, the United States would be 192 years old. Hue had been the capital of Vietnam for 400 years before the United States had become a country. For most of its history, Hue had remarkably avoided war. Since recorded history, the Vietnamese have fought the Cambodians, the Cham people, who occupied a large slice of Vietnam for centuries, the Siamese, Thailand, and most often the Chinese, who were determined to make Vietnam a vassal state and frequently failed. Since the Americans had gotten involved in Vietnam during the 1960s, the war had largely stayed away from Hue. Many people considered Hue to be divinely protected or just lucky, but when its luck ran out, it ran out. The Tet holiday is a time for celebration and family, which usually spans about a week. Throughout Vietnam, people away from their family homes head back, and while Tet is a time of celebration, it's usually a relatively calm and reflective holiday. Everything about it is the opposite of war, which is precisely why the North Vietnamese launched it on the first day of the holiday season. On the 31st, thousands of Viet Cong fighters emerged from hidden bases and hideaways through the cities of South Vietnam to assault anything that they believed aided or even symbolized the South Vietnamese government and its American allies. Outside the cities, North Vietnamese soldiers and Viet Cong launched an offensive in the countryside, attacking, raiding, and sometimes seizing smaller towns and villages. This was supposed to be the first phase of the battle. The second phase, which never happened, was aimed at starting a massive popular uprising throughout South Vietnam against the corrupt government of Nguyen Van Thieu. This never happened because ultimately the communists were defeated militarily. However, in terms of morale and psychology, the Tet Offensive was an American and South Vietnamese defeat. The undetected and massive attack shocked the American military, the American political establishment, and the American public. Until then, the military, under 4-star General William Westmoreland, arguably one of the worst commanders ever sent by the United States to lead a war effort, had spent years telling President Johnson and the American people that victory in Vietnam was just around the corner, or just a matter of time, or that it could be won with just a bit more aid, etc., etc. Before the offensive, Westmoreland and the South Vietnamese Army, or ARVN, for Army of the Republic of Vietnam, had begun to receive intelligence that pointed to, at the very least, a significant amount of enemy activity on the horizon. This intelligence was either ignored or downplayed. Some of it mentioned substantial numbers of enemy troops, which should have set off alarm bells. Still, Westmoreland, his staff, and the South Vietnamese ignored it for a variety of reasons. The first and foremost being that Westmoreland believed it to be false information intentionally spread by the communists. In his mind, the numbers being suggested were not possible, but they were. The major assaults in places like Saigon and South Vietnam's second largest city, Da Nang, were beaten back within a few days, with heavy casualties on both sides. Mopping up operations in the towns and larger villages took a few weeks. Most of the VC and NVA troops who had taken part in the initial assaults simply faded into the background, retreating into the countryside to fight another day, but not in Hue. Hue was occupied for a lot of reasons. Perhaps first and foremost, a long occupation of the imperial capital would show the world, and particularly the USA, that the communists were able to not only launch a nationwide attack, but also occupy a major city. Another reason was that a large section of Hue was known as the Walled City, a citadel, a last-ditch fortified strongpoint built centuries before in case the city was attacked. Taking the city would also allow the VC and NVA to use it as a communications center to broadcast propaganda. Route 1, the main coastal supply route in South Vietnam, ran right past Hue. Cutting the road would help slow down reinforcements and supplies to the area. The Perfume River divided the city and allowed the communists to control traffic and create military choke points. Like many Vietnamese cities, much of Hue was a densely populated maze of houses, shacks, streets, and alleys, perfect for urban defense and hiding hundreds of troops and weapons. For weeks before the battle, VC troops had infiltrated and hidden within the city and were not discovered.